Yes guys, welcome back to the MMA Sucker channel. I'm Frazer Krohn and let's talk struggling Bellator fighters coming over to the UFC. Now, I'm pretty much just going to talk about the main three. I'm going to briefly touch on one fighter after I talk about the main three, and then I'm going to touch on potentially an exception. But let's talk about the main three fighters that have come over with a ton of hype and really not lived up to it. So let's look at our first guy, this guy, Aaron Pico. Just 2 days ago, UFC 319, on the end of one of the most brutal knockouts we've seen in UFC history. Let's be honest, it was brutal. It was a rough knockout for Aaron Pico. Spinning back fist knockout at the hand of Lerone Murphy. He entered the UFC with a record of 13-4, but really hadn't fought anyone of Lerone Murphy's level. Now, let's look at our next guy, Patchy Mix. Patchy Mix, although he did lose his UFC debut, it was via decision. It wasn't blasted like Aaron Pico. He entered the UFC at 20-1 and was a former Bellator bantamweight champion. He lost via unanimous decision, and he was dominated in that fight. And let's look at our third guy, Patricio Pitbull. He entered the UFC with a record of 36-7, again a former Bellator champion, and he lost in convincing fashion, just like the other two guys, to Yair Rodriguez. Okay, so we've got our sort of three main guys, should we call them, that have come over from Bellator and not done well in their UFC debuts. What's the reason for this? I think there's potentially three reasons to this. Reason number one, I looked into the attendances of the fights from the three fights prior to joining the UFC and then the UFC attendances. Essentially what I'm saying is the moment, are the octagon jitters, has the fans of the UFC got too much for these guys entering into the UFC? So let's look at Aaron Pico first. When he fought, his last fight for Bellator, was PFL versus Bellator. That was an 18,000 capacity. But that comes with the caveat of it being in Saudi Arabia. Now, as much as I respect Saudi Arabia, the fans there are not the raucous fans that you get in the US. Let's just say that. Another one of his fights, he fought at Bellator 299, and that was in front of 10,777 fans. And another one of his fights was at Bellator. Bellator 271. That was in front of 2,411 fans. So just 2,411 fans at Bellator 271. Now you compare that to UFC 319, where he made his debut this past weekend. It's the biggest crowd that he fought in front of. 20,023 was the reported attendance for UFC 319. Patchy Mix. Bellator competed at Bellator Championship Series 2. It wasn't announced the attendance for this one, but the Accor Arena in Paris has a maximum capacity of 20,300, and I would be surprised if it was a sellout. Even if it was a sellout, I think a lot of the fans will have left after Cedric Doumbé did his thing in the co-main event. It's difficult to get attendances for a lot of Patchy Mix fights. However, I got the attendance for Bellator 289, where he competed in front of 3,724 fans. Patchy Mix is slightly different because he's been in and around the UFC. He's been in a UFC corner alongside, I think it's his wife, it may just be his longtime partner, Tatiana Suarez. He was in her corner when she had the title fight, the unsuccessful title fight. He's been in and around the UFC, but when he made his debut at UFC 316, he competed in front of 17,343 fans. Without a doubt, the biggest crowd I think he will have competed in front of. Like I said, I don't think the Championship Series at the Accor Arena in Paris was a sellout. Now, Pitbull is a difficult and a different situation altogether. he's competed in front of big crowds, and when making his UFC debut at UFC 314, it was not the biggest crowd that he had competed in front of. UFC 314 had a crowd of 18,287. He competed at Bellator 297 that had 6,277 fans. So almost, let's say, 3 times the amount for his UFC debut. However, he competed at Super Rising 2, which had a reported attendance of 24,264, blowing the UFC 214 out of the water. 6,000 more fans in for Super Rising 2. So that is the sort of that. A Pitbull is the one with a sort of asterisk to his name as to potentially not letting the moment get the better of him. Now let's look at the opponents prior to the UFC and whether it's just quite simply too much too soon for these guys. So Aaron Pico, the 3 opponents he faced prior to joining the UFC for Bellator had a combined record of 44 wins and 19 losses. He's facing, on his debut, the number 6 ranked guy in Lerone Murphy. He's going up against a proven, undefeated, confident featherweight who is coming off some huge wins. Barboza in a main event, Dan Ige and Josh Emmett in a main event. And you're throwing a guy in Aaron Pico in there against an absolute killer in Lerone Murphy. Was it too much too soon? Evidence would show that it was. Now, Patchy Mix, his 3 opponents prior to joining the UFC had a combined record of 62-9. He was facing Mario Bautista, who had wins over Damon Blackshear, Ricky Simone, and Jose Aldo. He beat Jose Aldo, and in his next fight fought Patchy Mix. Mix is going in there against Bautista, who has a 16-2 record. He's riding a 7-fight winning run and is was at the time highly ranked in the bantamweight division. Again, it proves to simply be too much too soon for Patchy Mix. And it's the same when we come to Pitbull. His 3 opponents prior to joining the UFC had a combined record of 55-11, but he's facing Yair Rodriguez, whose 3 wins prior to beating Pitbull. 3 fights prior to beating Pitbull were against Josh Emmett for the interim title, a title shot against Alexander Volkanovski, and then I believe it was a main event against Brian Ortega, who is a multiple-time title challenger. Pitbull's being thrown in there against a former title challenger and proven main event star in Yair Rodriguez. It was too much too soon. But there is an exception. There is an exception to this, and it is this man, Michael Venom Page. He joined the UFC slightly earlier than the other 3 guys, Mix, Pico, and Pitbull, and he actually got off to a winning run at UFC 299. He beat Kevin Holland by unanimous decision. That was in Miami, Florida, with a reported attendance of just over 19,000. He then did lose his next fight, however, against Ian Machado Gary. Again, an attendance of 18, just shy of 19,000. But since then, he's bounced back. He's different because he's bouncing around the weight classes. But he's the only Bellator fighter that of note to come over in recent years that has really done well. He's now 3-1 in the UFC. He's got 3 big wins against Kevin Holland, Shara Bullet, and Jared Cannonier last time out at UFC 319. He does have that loss on his record to Ian Gary, but I don't think there's any shame in losing to a guy who, is even now essentially 1 fight away from a title shot. I would also say that there's one other exception to the potential rule of fighters coming over from the PFL or Bellator who are going to struggle on their UFC debut. And that is my favourite fighter at the moment, Dakota Ditchever. Dakota's 15-0 at the moment with 13 finished victories. She took some time off. She's the PFL 2024 flyweight tournament champion. She's the PFL Europe flyweight tournament champion from 2023. She's 27 years old. She's a horrible fighter to face because she is just so vicious when she gets in there. And I genuinely do think that if she came over to the UFC, if the UFC signed her today, obviously we know that they won't because she just recently signed a new deal with the PFL. But if she came over, I think you stick her in that top 5 and she does really well. I think she beats Natalia Silva. I think she beats Manon Fiorot. I think she beats Alexa Grasso, Erin Blanchfield, Jasmine Jastovicius, Macy Barber. She may struggle with someone like Rose Namajunas, who is also a very good striker, but I think she beats her just based on pace. But then you got to look at the champion, Valentina Shevchenko. Does she beat Valentina Shevchenko? And I think she'd have a really good chance against Valentina Shevchenko. For someone like Kai Asakura, who joined from Rising, has now gone 0-2 in the UFC since making his debut, it's disappointing. But I think one of the reasons that these Bellator fighters are so hyped up is because on paper they deserve it. Like I say, Patchy Mix 20-1 before joining the UFC. Patricio Pitbull, we know he's a legend of the game, he's a veteran of the game. And the same with Aaron Pico. Aaron Pico is potentially the biggest MMA prospect we have ever seen at any time in the sport. 13-4, amazing wrestling background, really, really good boxing, really, really good hands. And yet he was handled, knocked out cold, knocked out clean. Yes, these guys deserve to be hyped up because their record suggests, like especially Patchy Mix is 20-1, former Bellator champion coming over to the UFC. Yes, these guys deserve some of the hype that they're getting, but we also have to remember that these guys are not facing the elite of the elite. Lerone Murphy, like I said, Edson Barboza, Dan Ige, Josh Emmett, he's been in there with the elite of the elite, and then he faces Aaron Pico and handles him with relative ease. Yes, it was competitive for the first couple of minutes, but when you put out that badly, I don't ever see them two fighting again. There was nothing controversial about the finish. I think if the UFC decide to sign more people, more former Bellator fighters or former PFL fighters, yes, by all means we need to hype them up ahead of their debuts, but we also need to put a massive asterisk next to their name, and we need to recognise that these guys are not facing the elite of the elite week in, week out. Yes, they might train with them, but the UFC is a whole other ball game. Let's tailor our expectations a little bit when we're bringing over people from PFL or Bellator. Yes, hype them up. Like I say, a lot of their records show that they deserve to be hyped up, but we have to remember that they are coming over from Bellator. Let's not put them in with the elite of the division, the Yair Rodriguez, the Mario Bautista, the Lerone Murphys. Let's drop them in to those either fringe top 15, top 10 guys. I think anyone making their debut, aside, like I said, from Dakota, anyone making their debut should make their debut against someone ranked from 10 to 15 if, and only if, it kind of warrants it. They don't even have to fight a ranked guy or girl on their debut. That's my opinion on why Bellator fighters are struggling so much coming over from Bellator or the PFL to the UFC. Give me your opinions in the comments below. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.